We're Star Trek fans. Of course we're going to be obsessed with everything to do with Cetatian. Hello there, interwebs. I hope you're all doing well. I am your forever hyper-obsessed Star Trek novel fan, and I am here to review the latest Star Trek book release, this one titled Star Trek Lost to Eternity by one Greg Cox. As per usual, I'm going to stay spoiler-free on this book, so if you have not read it yet, don't worry, I'm not going to spoil any of the major plot beats. But I really am excited to talk about this book in particular because this is probably one of the most structurally interesting Trek novels that I have read in the past few years. Because the basic pitch of this book is that it is a Star Trek The Original Series novel, yet it ties together the disparate eras of the original series in kind of a unique way. Because it is set across 3 different time periods. And the way that those time periods come together by the novel's end is part of the fun and mystery of the story. And the choice of time periods is rather unique too, because the first time period that we get settled into is in the year 2024, so modern day, and we actually are following the story of a podcaster making an investigative true crime podcast titled Cetatian, because if you're going to make a podcast in the Star Trek universe, of course it's going to be titled Cetatian. But the reason it's titled Cetatian is that it is a podcast investigating the mysterious disappearance of one Dr. Gillian Taylor, the cetacean, the cetaceologist. Cetaceologist is that the person who studies whales? Who appeared in the movie Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. Now, we as Trekkies are all very well aware that Gillian Taylor decided to take a trip to the future with Captain Kirk and the gang to help with the 2 whales that were brought to deal with the mysterious probe that appeared in that movie. Man, saying that out loud, I forget how weird that movie. It becomes natural now that it's been years and decades since it came out. But man, that plot is so. It's very 80s. It's very 80s. Anyways, regardless. Love the movie. It's fantastic. But of course, the people in the universe of the Star Trek universe don't know what happened to her, at least until the 23rd century. So, initially I thought that this storyline was going to be the weakest of the 3 for me, but it actually turned into one of the most interesting because it really was really cool. How many times can I say really? To see a modern day podcaster kind of go back through and have a perspective on the events of Star Trek IV from like an outsider point of view, and seeing how she unravels all the different bits and pieces from that story. Like, for example, not spoiling like a major reveals that happen later on down the line, but sort of like hearing about people being like, yeah, I remember this weird guy she went on a date with at a pizza parlor, and of course we know that that's Captain Kirk, one of the famous scenes from that movie. Or like a guy who jumped in the tank with the whales with Gracie and tried to do a mind melt. They don't even say mind melt. It's just like a weird guy. We know that that's Spock doing that. And then things like, oh, there was a Russian spy involved in this, as we know as Chekhov in that movie as well. And so you just see this podcaster unraveling this mystery and kind of making interesting assumptions and be like, what in the world happened here? I just thought it was a disappearance of this one lady, and it's connecting to all these like weird things. And so that was just particularly fascinating. But what makes this even more interesting is you're sitting here wondering, how in the world is this going to relate to the other 2 storylines that come up in the book? Because the other 2 stories also seem very removed from each other. The second storyline takes place during the run of the original series show, where we have Captain Kirk and crew going on a mission to rescue a kidnapped scientist who was taken to this, pre-warp civilization planet in the neutral zone between the Klingons and the Federation. And as we know, during that period, it was a very cold war between the Klingons and the Federation. And so they're trying to rescue the scientist and not mess with the Prime Directive, while also not trying to heat things up with the Klingons. So that's a particularly interesting story. But again, I sit here wondering, like, how does this connect to anything? And then the third storyline that we get is set right after Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, and just before Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. And what's interesting about that time period is we also have dealings with the Klingons, but that is a time where post David's murder in Star Trek III, Kirk is still very prejudicial, even more prejudicial, against the Klingons. And so we see a Kirk who has kind of become a bit more hardened in his views of the Klingons. And we also, in that timeline, get a much closer look at Saavik, who is a character that we know we lost in Star Trek VI because the actress didn't come back and they replaced her with a different character in that movie. I think better for it because I think Saavik in that role would not have worked. But regardless, we do get to see her, and we don't get to see much of Saavik really in much of Star Trek. So it was cool to see her get a little bit more focus here, and how she has a little bit of PTSD with the killing of David in Star Trek 3. So I like seeing a different perspective on it, not just focused on Kirk. And the storyline there is we have a civilization of essentially immortal beings revealing themselves to the galaxy and saying, hey, we want to see if it's worth dealing with you, the rest of the galaxy. So we've invited Klingons, Federation, and the Federation and Romulans to all meet with us to sort of like just do a preliminary just sort of diplomacy and see how where things are at. And Kirk obviously trying to vie for the Federation to be the ones that they have a close relationship with and can sort of give their technology to. But obviously dealing with the Klingons and Romulans within all of that. So again, these are three interesting storylines on their own. It could make for fun one-off episodes of Star Trek the Original Series or something like that. But what is really fun about the novel is we get to unravel the mystery of how they all connect, because it takes a good chunk of the book before we get any sort of threads between the few storylines that we've been getting to really make themselves known. So that's just a really fun part of the novel. But what I also really liked is just Greg Cox's wonderful characterization of, especially Kirk, across these eras. As I've said, we got two different eras of Kirk, and you can see the difference between the two and how these men how he's changed in his life. And I really liked seeing that juxtaposition in a really fun way. And then within that, the adventures that we get, like I said, feel like their own original series episodes in and of themselves, kind of dealing with very prime directive-y, 1960s style stories. And I think they're all very characterized well and feel like they fit in that era really neatly. But as I said, the storyline that most fascinated me was the 2024 storyline, which was the storyline that I thought was going to be least interesting to me. And I just really loved the conspiracies and elements that all get brought in, and the way that Greg Cox writes these new characters, these podcaster characters. I will say the podcaster's assistant, who's the one like doing all the recordings, he's kind of a conspiracy theorist, and he does have one moment in the book that I think goes a little bit too far for me to kind of have one of those like very dramatic moments. Again, I won't spoil too much of what that is, but generally, I found that to be a little bit over the top to get where we needed to go, but I did ultimately really enjoy that storyline for the most part. The big thing for me, and this is where I'm gonna have to tiptoe a little bit, that I loved the most about this book is the villain. Again, without spoiling too much, the villain of this novel is really unique because quite often in Star Trek, especially when you get a villain of this scale, that this story has, they tend to be, the megalomaniacal Khan-like character of like, I will destroy the world, or I will get my revenge. And this character does have a very, let's say, over-the-top goal, and one that would very much fit in with one of those like heightened movie villains like Khan. But what I do like about him is he's not portrayed as like an overtly evil character. He has redeeming qualities, and even his goal is something that I really kind of understand deeply, and relate to, and why he would want to do it, and the ways he goes about it to try to be ethical, in what he's doing. But you, again, kind of like Kirk, see him across these different eras and see how he's changed and what's happened to him and how he's become a much darker person over the years, and that actually plays into the plot of the story as well. And I found that to be just a really fascinating way to depict a villain as someone who, ultimately has high-minded goals, ultimately is, not, he thinks he's being ethical, let me put it that way. But at the end of the day, you can see the slow slip into justifying more and more atrocious acts on his part to get to what he ultimately wants. So I found the villain just to be a really, really fun character in this. All in all, what I will say is this book does not hit the like emotional highs that I've read in like other books by, let's say, Una McCormick, or even the latest Seven of Nine novel that we got just a few months ago that I really, really love. Like the emotional highs of those novels are, I think, higher than this book ever gets. However, this is just a really fun romp, a really fun structure, and if you are missing just a sort of like, I just want to watch an episode of Star Trek, the original series that I haven't seen before, if you want that sort of vibe, this book has got you in spades because it's got 3 of those stories that really stand on their own, that have one element that connects them all together in a really fun, unique way. That is part of the mystery of the book. So, big fan of this one. I think Greg Cox knocked it out of the park. I did enjoy Lost to Eternity, and I'd highly recommend it to you. But beyond all of that, my friends, I hope y'all live long and prosper.